So I'm going to stand up here because I want to be able to look at my papers, but also it makes me look important. So I might talk to you up here on the dais. Firstly, let me say it's a real pleasure for me to be in this rather exotic part of the world. I've been to China many times, but never to Xinjiang, and it's a great delight to be here and to meet people from countries that I've never been to and hear their own experiences. So I'm looking forward to this next few days. My name is David Rosalky, and I'd really like you to call me David. There are a lot of other versions around. David will do. It's a simple name. And I come from Australia. If you're wondering where that is, Dr. Lee this morning was talking about the importance of the South-South dialogue. Well, you're going to have trouble finding a country that's more South than Australia. So I feel myself very much connected to the South-South dialogue through sheer geography, if nothing else. I want to tell you just a little bit about my background, not to give me my life story, but because that's important to you, I think, to see the perspective that I see matters from. Everybody has a different perspective, and that's actually part of what I think weaves through what Fazana was just telling you about. There are a lot of players in the game, and they all have different backgrounds, and they all have different experience, and the way they do their business day to day is quite complex, and it's a very human activity, all of this government planning and funding. It's not an engineering exercise, and we have to understand people. But just to give you quickly my background, I guess like everybody in life, my life sort of moves in decades at a time, and 30 years ago or something, I spent 10 years in the Australian Ministry of Finance, and I was quite deeply involved in the early years of the budget reform processes, which at that time, Australia was one of the leading countries. I think today, most people would say Australia has forgotten to change and move with the times and we're sitting behind, but we were pioneers back in the 80s, and I was involved in that. The next decade, if you like, I actually spent that period as what we call the Secretary of Departments. What that probably means in most of your countries in terminology would be a Director General in a ministry. And I was the Director General in about 4 different ministries, line ministries and a central ministry. The last 10 years have been the most enjoyable of all because I've been spending my retirement at the Australian National University teaching students and teaching a lot of people from other countries who are involved in public financial management. And I have to say that's a real pleasure because you hear what their circumstances are and you can exchange and discuss issues. So that's where I come from. So while I'm talking, you might sort of keep in mind what you think has influenced me. The first few slides of my talk are going to be about a sort of introductory, and they're really about the what and the why of connectivity. I'm talking the whole theme, really, of the next 3 or 4 days is about connectedness. And Fazana gave you a very good description of all of that complex network of connectedness. So I'm going to be eking out, if you like, issues of connectedness at different stages of the public financial management process. There are 3 critical activities, if you like, of the public financial management that we'll be discussing, unpicking in terms of how they connect together or don't connect together in some circumstances. The first is strategic planning, and that really is a process of mapping the strategic objectives of the government. And it is up at that strategic level, looking well forward, looking at how the government wants the country to go forward. The second component is the component of generating revenues and allocating those revenues to a number of programs, but the programs obviously would have to of the game. It doesn't necessarily mean they have different agendas, but they see the agendas through different windows, and that really does change one's view and how one puts programs into place. So connectedness becomes a greater challenge because of that dispersal, if you like, of processes of government. When we talk about those three elements, planning, budgeting and implementation, the problem with government, and it's not a problem in the sense of something that can be easily corrected, I think it's a natural problem of government, is that they are commonly quite disjointed. They're separate exercises. They're conducted by different people, not only in different organisations, but planning will be done with a high degree of involvement of ministers and external stakeholders perhaps. Implementation might be done by officials on a day-to-day basis that don't have a lot of connection with high management or ministers. So I think the process, the attribute, the characteristic that these three elements of government are very disjointed is a natural one, and we have to find a way of making them work together, although I think lumping them all together, because that's probably unrealistic. So we have to both connect and align the activities that are essential to effective. To connect and to align they are essential attributes for effective government. What do I mean by those two words? Connection here, we're talking about each activity, if you like, feeding into the next, being a starting point, influencing the next process, so that they don't start in different places. But alignment is something more subtle and more complicated. And that is that the processes actually work in the same direction and are not pulling apart and not conflicting with each other. Alignment is much harder, I think, than connection. You can always develop a system with a bit of effort that will pass information from A to B and from B to C. But whether the activities of A, B and C are all lining up to reinforce the process and get the best result is a harder exercise than any exercise. And we are talking here about a system. 20, 30 years ago, system theory was very important. It came out of the engineers, and everything was engineered. And you can connect things together with a screwdriver, it will all work. But we are talking about a complex system here with lots of parts, and all the parts interact. And it's that interaction with everybody knowing where they fit in the system and how they influence it, and with whom they have to contact, that are the elements of good connection and good alignment. So, Havana explained in excellent terms to you the nature of the results-based framework, but I'm going to be, as I said, I'm picking it a bit, and I might be repeating some of those things, but from my perspective. And I think one thing that I would add to what Havana said is that yes, we all have to have the same results, but in fact, because we're at different levels of the system, we see these results differently, we express them differently. They serve different purposes at the strategic down to the implementation level. So what I say here is that planning sees results as at a high level, at a visionary level, if you like, a strategic level. The resourcing has to make sure that resources are being allocated to service results in the most effective way, and therefore the results at that point have to be more better defined, more concrete. And then you get down to the actions, the daily activities of public officials in implementing, and those actions have to be judged on the basis of achieving or at least contributing to the results. So we have a high-level expression of results, those results being expressed in a way that resources can be effectively allocated, and then the activities and implementation being judged whether those results are being achieved or the extent to which they are being achieved. So there's a logical connection. What's the logical connection? Budgeting process needs to do two things. It needs to find fiscal space, and we'll talk about that more in the next lecture, and to allocate resources the programs that contribute to strategic goals. And the scrutineers, the people who monitor, who watch, who comment, who criticise processes of government, have to judge the results. So again, you can see the logical connection between the processes that people at different levels, budgeters, managers, and implementers, and scrutineers, all are using the results in an interconnected way. What I see in this difficult exercise of making a big system results focused is that the results have to cascade, have to drop down level by level from the strategic down to the operational. The person who's implementing a particular program sees results quite differently from the person who is envisioning the strategy well ahead. And that linkage between high-level results right down to detailed results is quite a difficult task. But it's even harder then to use that sequencing of results to drive the allocation of resources, to build the results logic into the process of budgeting. So just to encapsulate that point, to me, what I see in the results framework is that the strategic vision has to be brought down to program results, has to be brought down to detailed activity results. They're all expressed differently, they're all seen differently by the different players, but they are the same. It's a cascading of all the same results, and that process has to be serviced by the budgeting process. If that isn't done, if there isn't that consistency and connection between the results seen by the different players at different levels, the plans themselves become little more than political rhetoric. I think Rosalky made the point. You can have a plan, but what's the point if it isn't actually achieving the intended results of the government? And of course, that's seen by the people of the country. And you get a breakdown in the confidence and the legitimacy of the government's plans. And in serious cases, you get a breakdown in the confidence and legitimacy of government itself if the people can't see the plans as having any realistic application. So I'm trying to make the point there with those slides is that connection and alignment are critical, but it's very difficult. And I don't think it's all just one set of results through the whole system. It's a cascading set of results that have to connect together logically and be used at the different parts and be used by the people who scrutinise and monitor the activities of government. So let's get down to the planning itself. Clearly the purpose of development planning is to set a direction for the economic and social change in the country. And that direction is often expressed in quite visionary and aspirational terms. This is what we aspire to, this is what we want, this is the end point that we envisage and a pathway we see getting to it. A strategic planner who sees detail can't see the road, can't see where they're going, can't see the path, can't see the end point. So it is important to be visionary and aspirational. And another purpose of development planning is to announce, from a political perspective and for the population of the country, to announce a medium-term political agenda. Thirdly, a purpose is to move in a systematic and integrated way towards specified goals to advance that social and economic lot of citizens. And of course, the Millennium Development Goals provide a sort of a mutually endorsed, internationally endorsed set of those goals, but each country will have their own goals to be added on top of those. So, to move then from this aspiration, which I think is an important For the goals to be actually activated by government, to become useful, they need to be stated in practical terms. They need to be assessed for feasibility and scaled perhaps to make them achievable. Dreams are always wonderful, but then the next step is to say, well, what part of that dream can we realistically implement, can we realistically resource, and what are the priorities, etc. So there is a process then of bringing the aspirations down to reality, which may be quite a conflict for the government. And of course, with looking at the feasibility, the capacity to resource these objectives, they have to be given relative priorities and sequence. What order is sensible? What are the most urgent, or the most important, or perhaps even what is the logical sequencing, that a certain activity has to go in place before others can build on it. The ideas have then to be resourced and implemented. To move from the aspiration to the fulfillment. Sorry, I'm forgetting to push the button. All what I just said to that slide. To move from aspiration to fulfillment can be quite a leap. And to an extent, how much of a leap, how difficult it is to make that transition depends on the language that's in the plan. And plans are very different. I had a look at just a few from different countries, and they are quite different in their structure. One thing I do observe, which I think is an important point, is that plans are often expressed in directional language. That is, and they don't always have the specifics in them. In other words, they talk about improving something. Reducing poverty, improving economic competitiveness in world markets, whatever the word might be, they're more directional than explicit at the plan level. And you can say, well, that's a bad thing because they're not explicit. But yes and no. I think for a strategic plan to point out a key direction is of considerable value. That's where we want to go. But, isn't there always a but? If you're going to talk about directional planning, then you have to be able to set milestones, be able to measure progress along that path, to monitor and know that you're achieving staged results, even if you haven't been able to specify the end point. I think an example of what I saw in what is a very comprehensive planning process in the People's Republic of China here is their current plan, 5-year plan, emphasises the concept of inclusive growth. And I think we all know what that means, that they don't want the economic growth to be having winners and losers and driving the winners and losers further apart. So we have an image in our mind, we have a direction, and we can then perhaps think about some ways of measuring that, some ways of making some progress towards that goal. But the goal itself is largely directional. So again, to be able to move from aspiration to fulfillment depends on what process actually is undertaken to generate the strategic plan, the development plan. Does the process include policy experts and line ministry people? Usually a plan then needs to be turned into policies, and I'm going to be developing that point more in a moment. So the broad directional strategic plan has to be turned into specific policies. And of course, often that does happen within the plan itself. For example, I think again talking about the plan here in China, it does develop its strategic concepts to quite a long way down the path in the wording of the plan itself. And the point I want to make here is that the process by which a plan is put together can be just as sure that the key people are brought in. And I know that in China and also in Indonesia, with their changing planning processes, they become very elaborate and they involve consultation and commitment from a very wide range of people. So what we're talking about is that we have to move from the strategic, and there's a continuum really from vision that's set out in strategic plans right down to program level and then down to operational level. Ultimately, government activity requires operational policies. For example, if you look at that objective in the Chinese plan of having inclusive growth, one can think of lots of different ways that one might try to tackle that problem. And the government of the day might see that to try to improve inclusion in their economic growth requires policies about income redistribution, or it might see policies on improving educational levels or giving industry support to encourage the economy in certain areas. And you can see how there might be later policies that might develop about better housing, availability of consumer goods. One can see lots of different sorts of policies that can contribute to the strategic goal. And those policies have to be decided and as the elements to build the strategic outcome. To me, this is the essence of the bridge between the strategic, the aspiration on the one hand, and the fulfillment on the other, is it's expressed in terms of what policies are we going to implement to achieve that strategy. Now, this is a point that is not commonly expressed this way, it's a bit of my own viewpoint, but what I try to look at is what is the process of conceptualising how policies work. And I'll give you a little example that recently I was speaking to defence and security people in the Australian government, and they were asking the same questions about how do we convince government that our policies are appropriate. And you can see the problem with defence and security, that if your objective is to have a competitive economy, one can see how education might contribute to that or some other process might contribute. But if you're trying to defend or ensure security, you're trying to prevent a risk. How do you demonstrate that your policies are appropriate to prevent a risk? If it doesn't happen, perhaps you're successful. But it's a very difficult thing to measure. So we have to conceptualise why we're introducing these policies to achieve the strategic outcome. And I've expressed that using this word, a model. I don't mean a mathematical model, but certainly a mental model. Certainly, if you like, a narrative, a story. So one might say, if one has decided that education is going to be the policy pursuit to reduce socio-economic disparity, one has to have a model for that. How does it work? Do I understand the dynamics of my society? Do I understand how education spreads, how people utilise education, how it feeds into their employment and into the development of strategic industries or something like that? I need very good data about current conditions and also about how current conditions can be influenced by those policies, the marginal changes. So I have a model in my mind, perhaps backed up by good data and evidence, and we hope we can and try to improve that, but not always backed up by good data and evidence. We have a model of how the policy might work, and my example there is very similar to what Rosalky was showing. I think education is a good sector to demonstrate these things in. So what does drive good outcomes? I start off with possibly some good information, but also some presumptions. I'm going to presume that the issue is proven. There's a big argument going on in Australia at the moment about whether class sizes, reducing class sizes, is the right way to improve education. don't know all the facts, we make assumptions. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to spell out the assumptions, to say what they are, and then we can assess, for example, the risk to achieving a policy. If I've assumed certain things and those assumptions are not correct, is that going to undermine the logic of the policy? I sometimes say, in fact I very often say, when a problem is being pursued and someone gives you the answer, I don't want the answer. That to me is much less important than the assumptions. I want to know, what do you assume to get there? What evidence have you got? And what might happen if you're wrong? Just to tell me the answer is 3, it's not very helpful. The assumptions might say it's somewhere between 1 and 10. And I don't know what drives that uncertainty. So assumptions are critical. We should express them. This is partly about words and terminology, but I think it's more than that. We're talking in this course about results-based frameworks. We're going to talk about performance-based frameworks. We're going to talk about different words. I'm going to use 3 different words that I think are logically connected together and very important. And in fact, I don't see results or performance as being the first element. I see the first element as being purpose. Why do we do these things? Why? The statement in strategic plans is often answering that question, why. We want to achieve this outcome. We want to improve socioeconomic equity in this country. That's the purpose. When we start then unpicking how to achieve that and express policies, we have to then say, well, what results in those policies are we going to assume will achieve that purpose? And ultimately, one has specific targets and other things that are monitored and measure the performance, and that can be much more detailed. But at the top level is this idea of knowing what you're trying to achieve. What's the purpose? When I do strategic policy review, sometimes for the Australian government, and I talk to senior officials who have running that program, and I've been running the program for many years, and I will say, why are you doing it? What actually are you trying to achieve? And I'm surprised how commonly they don't know the answer. And my next question is even harder. I say, if you know your purpose, how will you measure success? Will you even recognise you're being successful? So the results, yes, they come out, but they come out of already being clear about purpose and being clear about understanding what the success is going to be, and then you can start writing down what the results are that you have to achieve. So to use those words, we come to some more terminology, and Kazama used this terminology. If we're purpose-driven and we express the focus of results that is important for managers, it's very difficult for a manager managing a team of 10 people on a day-to-day basis to be looking up at some strategic objective or even at a policy outcome. It's too distant from that person to be effective. That person has to use something that they produce on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis that can be measured, and they are normally considered to be outputs. And there's a struggle that goes on all the time in results-based management about whether outcomes should be the basis, because that is getting closer to purpose, or outputs should be the basis, which is closer to management activity. The real answer is both. Managers need to look at outputs. Program designers and strategic people need to look at outcomes. The struggle for both is to make sure we're doing the same thing. That's the alignment. So we see then that there's a logical connection, this hierarchy of results from plans through policies to program activity. And of course, it's all based on a maximum amount we can get of data, of understanding, and a set of expressed assumptions. And if you like, this is an analytical process. I've spoken to some of you about your activities in government, and the word analysis kept coming back a lot. It is doing what I'm talking about here. It's bringing the data, bringing the understanding of the linkages, understanding baselines, understanding the dynamics of the economy and society, and therefore being able to model how policies are likely to deliver on strategic results. The monitoring that Hosanna talked about quite a lot in her presentation has to be done at different levels to make sure that this cascading set of results are all effective. Now think about this, the manager of some education program is making sure that teachers are being properly trained through the teachers' colleges. He or she monitors his or her results at that detail level. Are we getting the enrolments? Are they completing the course and going on to leave the institution? Am I achieving those things? That's my role. The program manager at a higher level will say, well, those people that are coming out of the program, out of the training, are they all getting jobs? Are they improving the education system? That's what I'm looking at. So I've got a team over there that's developing a curriculum, and a team over there that's making sure we've got enrolments, etc. And is all of that coming together so that I'm achieving the policy objective of more better qualified teachers? But then there's an even higher level, isn't there? There's a level of strategic, perhaps high in a ministry or even a central agency that's saying, well, we've got the teacher education going right, we've got the transport policy that Rosalky talked about going right, we've got all these things going right. Are we getting the outcome of a better educated workforce? So monitoring has to happen at all levels and to be appropriate to the activities of those people. And of course, the highest level there is the evaluation process, where the whole policy activity has to be technically, if you like, scientifically tested when it's producing results. There's a point here, I'm sure I make it in one of these talks, but I'll say it now while I'm thinking about it, and that is that clearly monitoring at the activity level is the most immediate and the one that's most relevant to managers. The purpose, though, is at a high level. And as you go towards the high level, two things affect the capacity to monitor. One is that there's a big time lag. It can be months, years from the activity to getting the ultimate result. The other thing, which is associated with the time lag, but is a bigger topic, is that there are many external influences. So you can have been diligent with lots of good data, well-designed policies and programs to train your teachers, to get better education, to get better students coming out. But what's happened? Australia, that rotten country down in the south, is pinching all of your best students and offering them terrific scholarships, and you're losing them all. So as a country, your strategic objective has been undermined by something external that you may not have anticipated. So, as I say, the higher you go from the day-to-day activity to the strategic, the more external influences there are. It could be the GFC, the global financial crisis, which has changed people's thinking about their behaviours and their aspirations, where they want to go in what country. So it's much harder to look at the effect of your policies and your activities on the ultimate result the further you go up the chain. Now, there are implications, of course, for management. People forget about management. Management is a really, really important activity. Down at the day-to-day level of mustering resources, human resources, information resources, financial resources, and putting them to work to achieve set outcomes or outputs, really, for the manager. totally depend on to get the results that they're looking for, can often be lost. Lost in the sense of not knowing how they connect to the plan. They weren't involved in, they weren't consulted, they are told to do that. Your role is to ensure that enrolments in teacher training are kept up. But I don't know, I haven't got a perspective of why that's important. I don't want to question it so much, but I want to see why it's important, because it gives me a clear sense of what I'm actually doing to the overall picture. I remember in a job I had in the Defence Department in Australia many, many years ago, I was asked, I was thinking, bang, do that. And I thought, why am I doing it? I didn't know how much resource to put in, I couldn't sense what was important. So I used to go for a walk at lunchtime with my boss, and I'd say to him, just explain to me why I'm doing this. What's my purpose? Where do I fit in the big picture? And when I saw that, I thought, okay, now I know who's using my work, I know what's important, I know how to make it more effective. So that line of sight, which is a phrase that we use, I think it's very broadly used, doesn't necessarily mean that the manager down at the floor level is involved in writing the plan, but can see where he or she fits in the plan. Why they are doing what they're doing and how it contributes. That changes motivation. And we are talking about people. We have to motivate people. We have to have them understand where they fit. I think those dot points, the second half of the slide, are more or less mentioned. They're the different levels of applying the performance framework. But I'd encourage you to think about how that works in your organisations or in your governments. Clearly, managers who are managing a team produce an output. We understand, I think, how to oversight those people, how to monitor the results, encourage them, punish them if they don't achieve whatever it might be. But then how are those processes judged at the next level up? The senior management, the organisational executive. Is it all being brought together? Does one part of a ministry really know how they connect to another part of a ministry? When I ran a department, with what we call department, was usually called a ministry in countries. When I ran a ministry, I didn't have everybody just vertically controlling their own areas. The top executives of my ministry, I made them come together and say, if your results that you're responsible for involve that part of the ministry and that part of the ministry, it's your responsibility to consult and make sure they're working okay, because otherwise you can't achieve the results. So I was trying to enforce at the top level this integration of results up through the organisation, so all the different parts could contribute to the whole. So the management structure and how that monitoring is done at different levels is something you want to think about in your own organisations and even across ministries through the central agencies. So let's then come to the resourcing side of this. Is connecting planning and budgeting, this particular lecture. The budget, of course, is the link between the strategic goals and the implementation. A lot of the literature written about budgeting makes this next point very strongly, that a budget is ultimately a tool that converts policies into measurable action. Without being able to allocate resources, the policies just remain words on a page. So the budget process has to determine priorities. It has to create fiscal space. I'm going to be talking about that more in the next lecture, I think. But I emphasise the word create fiscal space. Very commonly that's described as measure the fiscal space or something like that. How much space do we have? I'm saying something more than that. I'm saying that fiscal space often has to be actively created, maximise the amount of fiscal capacity to implement the strategic objectives. And then, with know the priorities, you know how much fiscal capacity you have, the last point then is to allocate the resources to the appropriate programs to achieve the budget together are the key government documents, really. But they operate on different timescales. Plans, the plans are usually sort of 5-year or something like that. They're looking at a medium-term perspective. They're looking at directions. They're looking at visions down the track. Budgets, on the other hand, usually have an annual perspective. So we've immediately got a time frame difference between the plan and the budget. Secondly, they are rarely linked logically or procedurally. It is a common thing, despite all the efforts of Rosalky and the organisation she works for, and all the discussion and planning and training. It's very common that the budget is seen as a detailed, bottom-up accumulation of financial figures, properly accounted, probably put in the heads of expenditure and revenue or something like that. Very much dominated by the resources needed for the ongoing flow of government activity and ongoing programs. And here, from the other point of view, is a plan saying we want to do so much more and we want to do it as a priority. And so the budget and the plan are often actually not in conflict, they're not important to each other. And of course the procedural process is exactly what Fatan was talking about, all the connectivity, and the budget process has to feed, the planning process has to feed into the budget, and the budget has to feed back to the plan to make it clear what is feasible, what is affordable. Talking about different sorts of plans, it's an obvious statement that countries that are still going through a rapid development process put much greater emphasis on development plans. Developed countries rarely use something that they formally describe as a plan, but in fact there are commonly economic or fiscal perspectives over the medium term of what countries are trying to achieve. Australia, for example, is trying to achieve a budget surplus. Why economically is very hard to understand. It's more a political objective, but it does drive policy decisions and drive financial decisions. Often plans will come out of an election manifesto. So before an election, the government or the alternative, the contenders for government, will say what they are planning to do over the period of the next government, and that more or less forms a plan, so that when they come into office, they convert it to policies and carry them out, or don't, which would be a rather serious political issue in a country like Australia. And interestingly, sometimes activities go on in countries which really have the characteristics of a plan, but are not formally done so. I'll tell you a little example that's very, very interesting one in Australia. That about 15 years ago, or perhaps more, a law was brought in where governments must, every 5 years, project forward over 40 years, 40, I didn't make a mistake, but a long time perspective, where they see the budget going, where they see fiscal parameters going and economic parameters going. Now, it's not accurate, obviously, to do anything like 40 months, let alone 40 years, but it gives trends and it gives a picture of what's driving budget outcomes and what's driving economic outcomes. And one thing that was seen in Australia in the first 2 of those projections was done was that the ageing of our population, some of your countries have a greater problem there than Australia does, but as our population gets older, it puts huge pressure on things like health expenditures. And yet there are fewer people in the workforce, younger people, to service them. So we saw a major problem coming a long way down the track, and that gave the government the impetus to change some policies, to encourage and give incentives for older workers to stay in the workforce, that sort of thing. You can put that in the category of a long-term strategic plan, a direction, which gave rise to policies to change that direction. And it really did have the same effect. Even though it wasn't called that, it has to go through the same processes of connection with all the with the budget and with implementation. think all of that has been said before. I don't think I want to add anything to those observations. It's about the nature of plans, especially in developing countries, and you know that better than I do. I might say that I think there's a dynamic here, and I'm not an expert in this area of development plans and development donor activities, but a trend I've been observing from some of what I've been reading is that donor countries and donor organisations are moving away from some of the explicit funding of particular development outcomes, particular programs, particular investments, to donating more broadly into governments for them to distribute across their budget on the basis that they're pursuing what that donor organisation sees as a clear strategy. That's quite a different activity, and I think that actually allows the recipient countries, the partnership countries, to move their processes more and to integrate more than to have to tie their plans to the donors. I think that's a very good thing, and I think it's something that countries like the ones who have these development plans can exploit and move more quickly to reforms because of the change in the donor attitude. I don't know which that's a good development either way. I mentioned that the plan and the budget have a two-way link. Of course, the plan tells the budget what it has to allocate, but the budget also tells the planners what's feasible. It has to look at costs, has to look at affordability, has to look at trends. That's where the medium-term framing that we'll be talking about tomorrow comes into play. That if the trends are bad and the fiscal capacity is reducing, that obviously limits the plans. And by the way, there's often a tension. This is part of this, if you like, the different agendas that Fazana mentioned, that budget officials and budget processes often emphasise the fact that they have to continue to resource ongoing programs, ongoing administration. And they resist the pressure to have to restructure the budget, to reduce spending on certain areas in order to allow resources for strategic options. The planners, of course, are saying, we're trying to move on to that direction. Help us move. And it is really a tension until those two processes see themselves as achieving the same result. Which means, of course, that budgets have to move from being purely a tool of administration to become a tool of strategy as well. And that is not the natural state of the budgeting activity that goes on in most countries. How you get planning and budgeting to come together involves what I've described here as thinking in the same space. And the example I just gave is an example of thinking in different space. So while plans envision end states, budgets are built up from the bottom up. So we have a challenge here that the budgets have to start expressing themselves not simply in detailed heads of expenditure, etc., which are relevant to managers, but they have to now be able to be rolled up into purpose-driven activities, programs, if you like. The link here really is about program budgeting. That budgets have to be expressed in some sort of program. Sometimes there are international budgeting structures that emphasise what they call function. It's a bit close to the sector, the word sector that Fazana was using, but it's an internationally accepted set of functions. But they don't often align with what you do in your country exactly, or in the priorities. And it's important that the budget in your country reflects those integrated activities which are essential to the acceptance of the plan. But equally, the plan has to look down and say, well, we have this great vision. How now does our plan get expressed in terms of those same sectoral activities? So until the budget and the plan are able to find common language and a common framework, then it's very hard to get the two to integrate together in a logical way. did some reading about the changes that are going on in the Indonesian budgeting planning process. They've done a lot of reform. A lot of the things we're talking about in the next 3 days they've had a lot of experience with. But there was just one vague sentence that they are currently trying to link together their planning and budgeting through this common structure. And that was the end of the description. The simple fact is that it's not easy, and I don't know how they're going to achieve it further. And I think it takes real thinking in each country about how to have both the budget and the plan change their perspectives until they can be talking in a common structure. One common structure, as I say, is a program-based structure, which we might talk a bit more about tomorrow. I don't think there's a lot to be said here about the location of the planning office. We know very well that in fact most countries start off with a planning office being separate from processes like budgeting, but they're all located in different places. I know a lot come out of economic ministries, if you like, which is one perspective, but plans are about social, they're about security, and I think therefore the location of it has a different, already reflects a distinction that governments approach. One thing I need to say about Indonesia, which is relevant to this discussion of how you have a common structure, it might depend on how you actually organise government. That's now we're getting into really big stuff, because that's what your ministers and your prime minister or your president is really involved in. But Indonesia has an interesting model. I don't know how well it works, but on paper it's an interesting model. They have sectoral ministries, like everybody else, but then they have coordinating ministries. And they have broken up government essentially into 3 super sectors, if you like. They call them economic industrial, social welfare, and administrative political security. They lump them together. And they are separate ministries, but their role is coordination, and they're headed by very senior ministers. And the idea of that is to give an integrated oversight. So you can see that their plan would work through those super ministries, coordinating ministries, and the budgets can be rolled up to look at those super ministries. So often the capacity to have a common structure between a budget and a plan may actually involve some changes, not necessarily as dramatic as that, but some changes in the structure of government itself. To me, the critical linking factor is this point about policies. The visions and the plan are expressed as policies. Policies give rise to programs. They have to be challenged through the budgeting process and then put into perspective. So the policies enunciated as part of formalising the implementation of the plan gives you also a common language for the different processes of government. As I said, I think earlier, the Chinese plan has quite a lot of detail about policy, but some plans don't go into that kind of detail. I'm rushing this a bit, we're in the lunch hour. So I've got some summary conclusions there which you can read for yourselves. It just brings back some of those points I've been raising. Can I get that diagram up on the computer? Is it actually on the computer? I was really impressed about Paisano's presentation, the way all those things moved in the PowerPoint and fused together, and it reminded me of my nuclear physics. But I can't do that. And I try to express some of these complicated ideas in a diagram. I'm going to have to say, humbly, please excuse my very poor artistic talents here. But what I'm actually, pointer, yeah. Okay. You know, see that little bit off? But I can't. What I'm trying to sort of demonstrate here is that I've got 3 columns. One is the actual processes of government, planning, formulating policies, budgeting, programs, activities, and some the key players are in each step. But what I really want to emphasise here is the fact that this top part, if you like, is the planning part. It's where the planning expresses itself in policies. The plan has strategic goals as part of the results framework. The policies have their outcomes which feed those strategic goals. Up to this point, it's a statement of what they wish to achieve. If we got to the bottom of the diagram, once programs have been approved, activities, can you see them lost behind that thing? You can see them there. Activities are put in place. And the results framework, you have outcomes now being expressed as detailed outputs, so you're getting right down to the teams in line with the putting in place. But what happens in the middle? Once I've got specific policies, that allows the people who write the policies to say, look, these are the outcomes we need. Here are some proposals we're putting into the budget to achieve the objectives of the plan. And those proposals have to be costed, checked for feasibility, checked for priority, and ultimately receive their resources. So the budget sits in between this conceptualising of the plan and its policies up here, and the implementation down here. And it is the process that you have to go through in order for the individual programs to be approved. So that sort of tries to link in my logic the various elements, but also how all their various expressions of results come together. And then the red sections here, which is easy to see for you, the red sections just express some of the monitoring and the oversight, so that activities are monitored by their managers, and this is sort of internal, if you like. Those red statements are internal. Managers, program senior managers, and strategic people within government are checking that all of the activity is leading right up to the strategic goals of the program. But there are also external scrutineers. There's scrutiny by Parliament and auditors, and of course, ultimately policy evaluation. And this is a feedback to affect the policies to achieve the plan. So I'm just trying to bring together a lot of the elements I've been talking about in that diagram. To me, the important point is this one about the budget sitting in the middle and taking hold of the policies, turning them into proposals for the budget, approving them or not approving them, and then as they're approved, they become the activities of government. And that the results framework runs with that cascade. It's not all one expression, it's different expressions. It's an outputs, it's an outcomes, it's strategic goals, but they're all absolutely logically connected together. That's my model of how it works in a practical sense. I've talked through a good section of our lunch. Now, look, I don't want to that question. The simple fact is they're going to be breakout groups this afternoon, where I'll be moving amongst the groups to talk to people. There'll also be a report back on your breakout groups, where you're going to have to tell me how it's really done. And there'll also be a question and answer session at the end of the day. So I don't know whether the organisers think that's sufficient to handle questions on this topic. When's the breakout group? I think there's a country presentation first. We'll be getting a country presentation straight after lunch. But then for the rest of the afternoon, it is very much breaking up into groups discussing the issue. Now, I think I'll wait till the breakout groups to talk about what the issue will be that really is picking up this issue. How do you connect how in your country do you think that's a feasible